Hey, everybody. This is Michael Watley. I am the Republican Party Chairman, and welcome to NC GOP Studios for our weekly Chairman's Chat. And this week we are have a couple of very special guests, Dr. Tony Perkins with the Family Research Council and Congressman Mark Walker from North Carolina 6th District. And very honored to have both of you guys here. And thank you so much for joining us.
Michael, great to be with you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You know, guys, we hear every single election cycle that this is the most important election cycle that we've ever had. Every 4 years, the presidential election is the top of the ticket, but we also have senators' races and we have governors' races and congressional races. But it really does feel that this particular election cycle here in North Carolina is one of the most important election cycles we've ever seen. Talk for just a minute about what it means to the faith community when we look at the magnitude of this election cycle, where President Trump is up, the Senate balance hangs. We're looking at where we're going to be with a Republican or a Democratic majority in the House, as well as a governor's race here. That's the #1 race in the country. What does that mean when you guys look at our faith community and how important this cycle is going to be for them? Let's start with you, Dr. Perkins.
Well, you are absolutely right, Michael, in that we hear this every 4 years. This is the most important election of my lifetime. And people say, well, that's what you said last time. I said, I know, but it's true again. With each successive election, the stakes become higher because, let's face it, we are becoming a nation, unfortunately, that is more divided ideologically. I mean, we see it happening on the streets of America. And you know, I'm not going to make any apologies about the fact that someone's worldview is going to lead the way as a nation. And quite frankly, I'm all in for advocating for a conservative biblical worldview. The same view that the founders had to build the country by is good enough to lead the country with. Here we are 200 and almost 50 years later. So this is extremely important. We see it in contrast with judges, over 200 strict constructionists, textualists, however you want to describe them, those that actually believe the Constitution means something, that this administration has put onto the bench, working with Republicans in the Senate, which are extremely important because the Senate hangs in the balance in this election as well. But we, as you pointed out, an important state race there for governor. Dan Forest, great man, known him for many, many years. And the importance of having locally elected leaders is also critically important. I mean, we're seeing this play out all across the country. Governor Pete Ricketts in Nebraska just signed into law last week a ban on dismemberment abortions, continuing this march, this pro-life march that's moving across the country. All of that could be lost if people of faith and conviction do not show up to the polls and vote.
Yeah, Mark, to follow up on that, here in North Carolina, the faith community has played a major role in election cycles, going back to Jesse Helms and even before that, that they were so strong in terms of their constituencies. And we've got thousands of churches all across the state that, some of them are engaged and some of them are not. But talk about this election cycle here in North Carolina and what it's going to mean for the faithful this cycle.
Yeah, great question, Chairman Watley. I will tell you this. I don't believe that we've had any other election in history where religious liberty was more on the line. I applaud President Trump for taking bold action, as strong as any president. But even Democrats 40 or 50 years ago would have never thought about the time and place in our country where certain passages of Scripture would be considered hate speech. That's what's on the line for this election. We've talked about some of the pro-life issues as well. But the very thing that we hold dear, Second Amendment, and some of the things that we value as a faith community are literally, we're seeing persecution like we have never seen before right here in the United States of America. We see it through our tech company of Twitter and other social media platforms with the algorithms and how they're going after people who hold to the Christian faith specifically. And that's why this election is so much, there's so much on the line with this election. To the churches, to those connected with the churches on the line tonight across the state here, please encourage your pastors to get engaged. We're starting to see it move the needle a little bit. Sometimes at our more progressive evangelical side, it's almost taboo to talk about these things. Well, let me tell you who is talking about these things. It's the left, it's the radicals, and they want to take away everything that we cherish, that we hold dear from a faith perspective. They're not even trying to cover it up anymore. That's what's on the line in this election.
Yeah, when you look at what President Trump has done as a leader, on these issues, he is admittterly not a perfect vessel, but the Lord definitely has picked him up and utilized him in terms of moving this ball forward. And when you look at the magnitude of what we're dealing with in this election cycle, I mentioned to Mark when we were talking earlier today that this is really kind of a counter programming for the DNC convention. Talk about what we're seeing from the Democratic ticket. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris both are supporters of abortion on demand. Both of them would oppose the right to life bill or infanticide prohibition bills, and they would put judges on the court that are not going to be strict contextualists. Talk about the divide that we see between the President Trump on one side of the ticket and the Democrats on the other.
That's a really, really good question. And Chairman Whatley, what I would say is, I'm going to go back to what you said just a moment ago about, the president may not be a, perfect vessel. Well, none of us are. And I'm not going to say who in his cabinet, but one of his cabinet members quipped one time when I was discussing with him that the president may not be a Sunday school teacher, but he sure knows how to hire them. Because if you look at his cabinet, it's filled with those who have taught Sunday school. And why do I mention that? Because Paul Weyrich, now deceased, longtime political leader in Washington, used to say that personnel is policy. And when you look at the policies of this administration, there is a clear contrast between what is being proposed by the Democratic Party. And this is where, I can lose some people because I talk about the party platforms because people think those things don't matter and that's for policy wonks. No. These party platforms are important because they're basically telling you where they want to take the country. And in fact, about 80% of the time, the parties adhere to these platforms, according to a study that was done over about a 4-decade period. There could not be, and I know that the Democrats this week will adopt their draft platform. The Republicans have been working on that, will be advancing what was in 2016, essentially. And the contrast on life, the contrast on judges, the contrast on religious liberty. Just one fact, you look at the Democratic platform, you try to find the word God. I remember a few years ago, actually, there in Charlotte, they voted God out of the platform and then had to put him back in. But you find him only one time, but not as a noun, as an adjective. God-given skill is listed in the Democratic platform. It shows a priority of who we see as really a defining authority as God. And so I would just tell people, look at the comparisons of the platform of those policies, and it will tell you a lot about where the two parties want to take the nation.
I agree with that. I don't think there's any bigger contrast than when it comes to this singular issue. One of the most powerful nights that we have had in the almost 6 years that I've been in Congress was when it came to what we call the Born Alive Amendment. Now, just a few months earlier, we had the Pain Capable Child Protection Act, which was no abortions after 20 weeks with a few exceptions. On that one, we picked up 6 Democrats. On the Born Alive, just 6 months' time, my point is how far the progressives are pulling the party. Only 3 Democrats voted that if a baby is to survive a botched abortion, then the healthcare provider should do anything about sustaining its life. This is third world. Yet this is the position of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris adhere to. And they're not trying to cover it up. I was so moved by the 3 Democrats who were courageous enough to stand with us. I actually went back to my office and wrote them a thank you card. But this is not an offshoot. This is where the party is on the left now, that a baby, and we were able to, Chairman Whatley, we were able to identify more than 1,500 adults who had survived a botched abortion. This isn't a one-off, but to get out there and literally see, and let me just be so bold as saying this is becoming part of the religion on the radical extremist left to be able to oppose what we believe and what we hold here to in our traditional values.
And you bring it back here to North Carolina, Governor Cooper actually vetoed the Born Alive bill here in North Carolina. We were unable, the Republicans were unable to override that veto. So that is something that has been left on the cutting room floor for it. And Dr. Perkins, you mentioned, Dan Forrest, who's running for governor, who is a solid pro-life, faithful man. The difference that we would see even here at the governor's level, you mentioned my good friend, our governor over in Nebraska, as well as other governors across the country who have supported, the Born Alive bill. Talk about what it means at state policy levels and how that really matters in our elections here at the North Carolina level.
I will, because that's actually my background. I started as a state representative in my home state of Louisiana. And I quite frankly think that the states are the laboratory for public policy. And that's where we actually can affect the greatest change. I mean, one person literally can change the direction of a state legislature. And of course, having a good governor at the helm is very powerful. And you can, it's actually a way to protect the citizens from out of control government. I mean, that's the way our founders established this system. So I think having good men and women in these offices actually is absolutely essential. And probably next to Louisiana, I know North Carolina pretty good. I've been to every county in North Carolina on a bus. And I love the folks of North Carolina. It is a state that I've watched make the transition from being a Democratic controlled legislature to the Republicans having control of it and passing good pro-family legislation. And I'm hopeful that the citizens of North Carolina will recapture the executive branch there in North Carolina with Dan Forrest, who's done an excellent job as lieutenant governor, and I think will make an outstanding governor. And clearly, he's needed looking at where your governor has taken the state. And so first off, I want to applaud the conservative members of the legislature there that have stood up to this governor and have stood against really, a few years back during the Obama years, stood up against really the whole political establishment when it came to common sense issues like bathroom bills and such. And you've got some great men and women who have been serving in North Carolina. And I would just, and I think Mark would probably echo this, it's a biblical admonition, is that do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due time you will reap if you don't lose heart. And so I think it's extremely important that we have a long view, and even longer than some. I think as I approach this from a Christian perspective. I'm unabashedly a Christian, and I follow Jesus Christ. And we're to have kind of an eternal perspective of things. It helps us keep our eye focused on what is important. But if we just continually doing the work, influencing the culture around us, engaging in the politics, engaging in the political process, the educational process, we'll see change. North Carolina is reflective of that. There's many pastors I've worked with in North Carolina that over the years worked hard to get a marriage amendment through and just did the hard work. And as a result, we've seen some really good changes in North Carolina, one of the best economies in the country. So please, North Carolina is an important state. Don't grow weary in doing well.
Yeah, Mark, we talk about evangelicals and their conservative worldview and their being able to turn out. But we've heard that there are as many as 35% of evangelicals that are not registered to vote. And we've got churches that some of them would like to encourage their parishioners to go ahead and engage in the political process and try and help them learn about the candidates, and others that don't. How do we reach the rest of those evangelicals that are not registered to vote, or those churches that are not, engaged with these types of issues yet?
Crucial question. Let me say to Tony, he's dropping Paul the Apostle on me. It's hard to keep up with that, but Tony's done a great job and is very well respected, as you know, throughout our faith community in North Carolina. Specifically to your question, Chairman, it is one of the tragic things that we've seen in the 21st century. If you go back a few decades where the social issues weren't so much a part of the political environment, I guess you could make a case if you're just arguing how much money should be appropriated or allocated to this. But that's not the fight anymore. The fight is about the social issues. The fight is about life. The fight is about our family values. The fight is about religious liberty. So for the life of me, I cannot understand or wrap my mind around why a pastor or those who follow Jesus Christ would say, you know what, I'm just going to take a pass on this. There is too much riding on the line, not just for us, but for the future of our children and our grandchildren to be able to practice the faith that many of our founding fathers ultimately paid a price for, that we could be able to engage. So I would encourage even some of our younger churches. I understand trying to be culturally appropriate and seeker friendly and all the different terminologies or fads that come into the different church movements that last about 7 to 10 years. Let me use the word that Tony used, admonish those, if I could please, having been a pastor for 16 years myself, it is your duty, not an option, it is your duty to engage. And I believe the Bible teaches that as citizens of a country, we should be actively engaged. This, speaking the truth and showing compassion is not mutually exclusive. Jesus did it at the woman of the well. He had compassion, but he told her the truth as well. And I think that's where our pastors and churches, the entire evangelical community in North Carolina, really need to move forward on in this particular election.
Yeah, you know, Tony, the Family Research Council, I mean, you really are the tip of the spear when it comes to these types of issues and mobilizing evangelicals and Christians to understand public policy and to go out and vote. Tell us about what you see every single day across the country when you guys engage through the radio and through all of the other programs at FRC.
I will, Mr. Chairman, if you allow me just to tag on to what Congressman Walker said. It's so true. And I want to drive this point home. As Americans, we have a right to vote. You know, men and women have, put it on the line every day. Many have died to give us that freedom and right and preserve it. So as Americans, we have a right. But I believe as a Christian, we have a responsibility to vote. And that's the message I take, because, you know, the scripture instructs us. And so I'm talking to the church community that you just mentioned about how do we communicate to them. Well, first off, we're to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And in a government that is ruled by law, where representatives are elected by the people, we have an obligation to participate in that process. And our government is a reflection of who we are. And so if we want government to be good, we have to have good people in government. And how do good people get there? Well, they only get there if people who want them there will engage in the process. So this is actually a challenging election cycle. I'll be very, very candid. I was out in California last week, speaking to a church of about 12,000. Now, California is very revved up because of what's happening there with their governor and the draconian actions that they're putting in place against churches. But we've got people that aren't going to church. So our normal place of where people are being registered to vote and being educated with voter guides is not happening to the degree that it has in the past. And in North Carolina, we have probably about 800 what we call our community impact teams that do voter registration in the churches. So we're shifting a lot of this online. And so we have actually a website that's called Pray Vote Stand, prayvotestand.com or .org. And it has resources there. Number one, we have a 10-week prayer guide. I first and foremost, I believe that Christians across this country should be praying for this election. And we've got a prayer guide for that for each week. We also have voter registration online where you can register to vote online. People aren't going to church, especially in the older demographics. They can register if they need to register, update their registration. They can do that online and then make sure that they vote. And of course, we're encouraging people. Every state has different guidelines. Some are adopting these mail-in balloting. You know, we're encouraging people to maintain custody over their vote, and if at all possible, avoid voting by mail. And if you can vote in person, do so. You can vote early, but we want to make sure you want to make sure your vote counts. It doesn't get lost somewhere on a dock at a post office. So we're just again re-emphasizing it may be a little more difficult. Challenges may be a little more great in this cycle, but by all means, we have to be registered, we have to be informed, and we have to vote.
You know, Mark, we've seen over the past couple of years, Speaker Pelosi has really become the most radical left progressive speaker that we've ever seen in the House. And she has been willing to throw away precedent. She's been willing to throw away, procedures that have been used. She's been able to throw away traditions, but she's also hammered through occasion after occasion after occasion anti-family, pro-abortion positions, through the House. Thankfully, we've got the Senate as a backstop there. But how critical is it for us to get back the House of Representatives and be able to put the gavel back into Republican hands and try and reel in, some of the excesses that we're seeing from Nancy Pelosi and the progressives in the House right now?
Yeah, and Chairman, that's a great point. And she's even going further left to be able to placate some of the AOCs and others that make up the Progressive Caucus, because that's the loud and most effective group of the Democratic Party as we see it now. It's incredibly important because that's where all legislation begins, is in the House. That's where all the funding is written into, is in the House. I think it's crucial. But as much as it is the House, this election is so important because we also must maintain a majority in the Senate. We talked about the administration side. If the Democrats, God forbid, they were to win all three, their plan is, I don't know if they're even trying to cover it up, they will expand the Senate to include 2 seats from Puerto Rico, 2 seats from Washington, D.C. They'll do away with the filibuster, and they will expand the Supreme Court to guarantee that they have a majority, probably creating havoc for a generation. I don't want to be doomsman, but we may never get it back. That's why when we talk about the importance of this election, where there's the House, and there are 19 seats we need to swing, that I think Trump won 29 seats. So there's a chance to do the House, but definitely the Senate, certainly the administration. But that's why, as we talk about the most important election in our lifetime, we know the playbook of the Democrats. They're going to do something so radical that we've never seen any other Congress or administration do, never even thought about it in our lifetime, in history maybe, and that's why we've got to be able to stay the course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I want to touch on something that Tony mentioned earlier with the judges and the fact that President Trump has made over 200 lifetime conservative federal judicial appointments that have been confirmed by the Senate. 2 of those are sitting on the Supreme Court right now, and thankful for it because when we think about what would the candidates be that Hillary Clinton would have appointed if she had won that election, for a lot of Christians, a lot of faithful people, voters, the Supreme Court really was the issue that decided that they were going to support President Trump with. So, talk about the import, not just of all of the judges and remaking the district courts and remaking the circuit courts, which is huge, but the Supreme Court, that really is something that is generational. It's lifetime, and we're likely to see more appointments coming down the line. Tony, how important is it for us to give President Trump 4 more years to continue to reshape the judiciary?
This will probably be, he's done a lot of great things, but this is probably the most profound because, as you pointed out, this is generational. They've strategically placed young men and women on the court who will be there for a while, to the chagrin of the left. And they're remaking the courts. They're restoring the courts, I should say, back to a position of being an institution that stays within the boundaries of the Constitution, that the Constitution created for them, calling the balls and strikes, not legislating from the bench. So when we look at the next 4 years, you don't have to be a prophet to look at the Supreme Court and see you got a few folks there that are, they may not be there for much longer. And so there's going to be vacancies on the court, and there's rumors that someone to retire. And so it's going to happen. And so who do you want? You want Joe Biden and Kamala Harris picking the next Supreme Court justices? Or do you want Donald Trump and Mike Pence making those selections based upon their track record of, which I would say is stellar. Now there's a few I would take issue with, but just a couple. But out of all of the ones they've picked, I think they've done an extremely good job of putting qualified constitutionalist, textualist onto the courts.
Yeah, Mark, when we look at Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, all we have to do in terms of understanding what they're going to appoint is look at how they have treated other judicial nominees that have been appointed while they served in the Senate. We kind of look at how Kamala Harris went after Brett Kavanaugh for being Catholic, and specifically attacked his faith with it. Talk about how important it is for us to make sure that, as you said, we've got an overall context where we're looking at judicial appointees, not just from the presidential making it, but from the Senate working through that through the confirmation process. And how important is it for us to have Tom Tillis sitting on the Judiciary Committee? You know, he's not only one of the 3 or 4 most vulnerable majority maker seats in the Senate, but with his role on Judiciary Committee, how important is that for North Carolina to send him back to help make sure that we're treating these nominees fairly?
Yeah, I'll take the second part of your question first. It's absolutely crucial, along with Cory Gardner, Martha McSally, and Ms. Brooks there in Maine, Ms. Collins there in Maine. These are considered the 4 most seats in jeopardy. So we've got to get out there and certainly work hard for Tom, because it is an important position to be on that Judiciary Committee to make sure that the president is protected in getting these nominees across the finish line. Zooming out to your first part of your question, we've already seen a sample of what Kamala Harris, her behavior when it came to dealing with Brett Kavanaugh, the abuse, the harassment that was evident that played out. I hope people will remember this when it comes to the November election and get a little bit of an idea as far as how she might govern when it comes to such. If you had no other reason, and there are others, if you had no other reasons than to support the Trump-Pence ticket in 2024, this is it. You may say, well, it's a little bombastic with the personality, all these other things. But let me tell you, because of how many decades this will impact, and listen, we're not just talking about the Supreme Court. We're talking about these other federal appointments. In fact, President Obama made more federal judge appointments than the 3 presidents before him combined. That is why this is such an important issue. If you can find no other reason to get motivated, go out and vote for the president, to certainly support our statewide candidates as well, because this is going to be something that may be sticking around long after even that we may be gone.
Yeah, you know, and Tony, when we look at the courts, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about our state courts. You know, here in North Carolina, we've got a 6-1 progressive liberal Democrat majority on our Supreme Court. It's frankly one of the most liberal Supreme Courts anywhere in the country. And the decision making that we're seeing on that court, along with our Court of Appeals, which the Democrats have an 8-7 majority on, really reflects more NYC values than NC values. And we've got those crucial seats are up. We've got Justice Paul Newby, who's running for Chief Justice. We've got a couple other candidates, Phil Berger and Senator Tamara Behringer, who are running for the Supreme Court to be able to try and win back and get some parity there. How important, when we look at the full scope of your efforts and the national grid, are the state Supreme Courts and Courts of Appeals?
They're critical. Justice Newby's a friend of mine. He's a great justice and would make a great Chief Justice there. And here's what happens. All right, when we do all the work. In fact, I was just looking at. I was going to make reference to this in Idaho. Now, this is a federal court, but the principle is the same. The state legislature there in Idaho passing a piece of legislation to protect women's sports, so that men can't compete in women's sports and defeat the women. I mean, that's kind of common sense. Well, a federal judge stepped in and blocked the legislation. So here you have the people of Idaho, you know, electing their representatives. They're doing the work, you know, standing up against all the cultural pressure. And then you have a federal judge just kind of sweeps aside all the work that they've done. Same thing happens in the state courts, where you have, you know, your elected representatives, whether it's a city council or whether it's at the state legislature, passing legislation that's reflective of the values within the limits of the Constitution. And you have then a court coming in, and because they're liberal and nobody's really paid attention to the courts, they legislate from the bench. And then all of that work is washed aside. So we cannot afford to neglect any level of government. We have to focus on all 3 branches: executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And we've got to be able to leave our imprint on all 3 of them.
We do. You know, Tony, you mentioned earlier COVID-19 and kind of the challenges that the coronavirus pandemic has brought really to Americans into the election cycle. You know, one of the things that we saw here in North Carolina, and we saw it across the country, is that we had a Democratic governor who used the pandemic and said that we were going to shut down churches. We were very fortunate that we had one federal judge who stood up and protected those churches. But, talk about the challenges that we see with these progressive governors going after churches, whether it's using the pandemic to try and shut them down, or it's going after their tax exempt status, or any of the other challenges that we see that churches are facing across the country, certainly here in North Carolina, with progressive governors like Roy Cooper.
Well, we work with pastors all across the nation. We've got about 15,000 in our network that we work with. And of course, our encouragement to them when this first happened, and we didn't really know a whole lot about it, the president said, hey, 15 days to slow the spread, patriotic duty. And then they came back and said, we need another 15 days. Okay, we're in. But then you had these, as you mentioned, these progressive governors, and it's very interesting to see the patch quilt around the country of Democratic governors, especially California, with one of the lowest mortality rates of COVID, I might mention, that has some of the strictest restrictions on churches, same with Nevada. And so they're using this. And I think, I'm just gonna be very candid, I've been calling for churches to push back on this because I think it's conditioning, to surrender what is fundamentally the responsibility of pastors and churches to meet, to exercise their religious freedom, and allowing governors arbitrarily to put these restrictions. This is dangerous. It's not just dangerous for the COVID-19 and this present situation, but I think it is a conditioning for future activities that would allow the government to step into a place that it has no business whatsoever. And that is whether or not a church meets and how they conduct their worship services.
Well, listen, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for coming on the Chairman's Chat tonight. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart, and it's so important for us, with all the voters all across North Carolina here, to understand the import of the election cycle that we have, both in terms of the presidential race, the Senate and congressional races, with our state races, and we've got to get a man of faith and a leader in the governor's mansion across the board. Again, one of the most important election cycles of our lifetime. And I can't thank the two of you enough for your leadership in these trenches. It is absolutely essential, both here in North Carolina and across the country. And thank you for joining us on the Chairman's Chat tonight.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Great to be with you, and great to be with my friend Mark Walker.
Always, Tony. Chairman, thank you as well.
Absolutely. And I also want to thank all of our viewers from across the state for joining us this week and every week. Join us again next week. We're going to have Senator and Professor Tamara Behringer, who's running for the Supreme Court, one of the races we talked about a lot tonight, and we'll be with her on Tuesday. And of course, next week, we're going to have the Republican National Convention. So I think we're going to have a lot of programming coming out of the NCGOP. So stay tuned for that. And everybody have a great night. Thank you.